Good morning. Before we get into the lesson, I do want to say one thing. After service this morning, anybody who is interested in being a leader in the discipleship groups, we're going to have a quick meeting. I mentioned this last week because that's what I talked about in the sermon last Sunday morning, was how we're going to start focusing heavily on discipleship starting next year. And one of those things is these small group discipleship things. And I mentioned at the end of the lesson, or sometime last week, we're going to have a meeting. So if you are interested or you just want to know more about what we're doing with all of that, please stay for that meeting. It won't be long, just kind of covering a few bases, make sure everyone understands what it's all about. That'll be after service this morning. I want to start off by asking this question. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Some see him as simply a moral or religious teacher. Some see him as a rabbi, a master, or personal teacher. Some see him as simply a prophet. Some see him as simply a miracle worker. Some see him as a political revolutionary. Some see him as Lord. We've been studying Matthew for a very, very long time. In fact, this is the 98th lesson that I've presented on Matthew. I'm hoping to be done in 2 weeks, which would make our series through Matthew 100 lessons. What we have seen in Matthew, what he has tried to make abundantly clear, is that when we look at Jesus, we see the Messiah. We see the Christ. We see the King. Matthew has made a very strong case for that throughout his account, but in these last few chapters, he is going to make it as obvious as possible. He is going to spell it out for us. The King who triumphantly entered into Jerusalem on Sunday is now reaching his coronation on Friday. He's about to be crowned as king in front of the Jewish people, and then those same Jewish people are then going to shout for him to be lifted up and exalted. What we're going to witness in our study this morning is the coronation of King Jesus. The text that we're going to complete, or at least the part of the story that we're going to complete this morning, is Matthew 27, 11 through 30. But we're actually not going to really look much at Matthew. We're going to focus more on Luke and John's accounts because they give a little bit more details to the story. And so we're going to focus on them. But a few weeks ago, we saw in verses 1 and 2 of Matthew chapter 27 that right in between Peter's 3 denials and Judas's suicide, we're told that the Jewish leaders took Jesus and they delivered him over to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And that's where our text picks up. But as I said, we're not going to look at it through the eyes of Matthew. We're going to look at it through the eyes of Luke and John. We're going to go ahead and start in Luke 23. Luke 23, those first 2 verses. Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Let's get to know Pontius Pilate for just a second. He was a Roman prefect over the area of Judea. He was a prefect for about 10 years. Now, a prefect was an army officer over 500 to 1,000 military troops, and specifically one that is put in charge of a difficult or an isolated district in the Roman Empire. Pilate lived in Caesarea, but it was required for him to be in Jerusalem when there were large crowds of people gathered together. And that's exactly what's going on here, because we are in the midst of the Passover. Whenever Jewish festivals would come along, Pilate was required to be in Jerusalem because there's going to be a lot of people there. And as prefect, he has several responsibilities, but one of the big ones is he is a peacekeeper. He's got to make sure peace is kept, even when there's thousands upon thousands of people that are moving into the city. And so, he's got to be there. He's got to personally make sure that things go as they should. Passover was especially an important time for the peace to be kept because it was a very popular time for Jewish revolutionaries to start riots and insurrections. The reason for that is, and it's really kind of obvious when we start to think about it, what was the Passover celebrating? What was it all about? They came together and they celebrated the fact that God freed their ancestors, Israel, from the oppressive Egyptian rulers that they were under the power of. Well, now, every time the Jews gather together in Jerusalem to celebrate their freedom, they're reminded that they're still under an oppressive power. The Romans still have their thumb on them, and they don't really have sovereignty. They don't really have freedom. And so when you get together and you start celebrating your freedom and you remember that you don't have it, some people might step up and say, well, let's make it happen. And so, this was a pretty dangerous time for the Romans when the Jews would get together and celebrate Passover. This made it a perfect occasion for these Jewish patriots to start uprisings and lead revolts. And so Pilate's presence there is crucial. Pilate was known, we actually know more about him than pretty much any of the other prefects. The reason for that is Josephus and a first century Hellenistic Jewish historian, or philosopher really, named Philo, talked quite a bit about Pilate. Pilate was very well known for his great disdain for the Jewish customs and the Jewish religion. He didn't care one bit about what they believed and what they practiced. Philo described Pilate with 3 words: inflexible, stubborn, and cruel. That's Pilate. There was a whole lot of violence that Pilate got started. He did so much violence to the Jewish and the Samaritan people because of his careless brutality and cruelty. And he was eventually removed from office because of that cruelty and brutality. This is the man who Jesus is sent to. Sanhedrin present 3 accusations against Jesus to Pilate. 1, he's misleading our nation. He's misleading our nation. They probably meant this, or at least what was going on in their minds, is he is teaching against our Jewish customs and our Jewish traditions, but they kept it, I believe, intentionally ambiguous. I think the reason for that is they know that Pilate doesn't care about that. But what he does care about is if Jesus happens to be misleading the nation of the Jews away from loyalty to Rome. He's misleading our nation. He's moving us away from loyalty to Rome. Number 2, he's forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. First of all, we know that is blatantly false, but it sounds good, so they use it. He's calling himself a king. Number 3. And anyone calling themselves a king is automatically against Caesar. These accusations from the Sanhedrin, they are designed to send alarm bells off in Pilate's mind. And this is what they want Pilate to think when he looks at Jesus. This is a political revolutionary who is trying to lead an uprising against Rome, lead the people away, and fight, start a war. That's what they're wanting Pilate to think. But unfortunately for them, Pilate doesn't really seem to be falling for it just yet. Look at John chapter 18, verse 31. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death," to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Therefore everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him." Pilate wants to know Jesus' response to these accusations that the Jewish leaders are hurling against Jesus. Are you the king of the Jews? Are you the Messiah? And Jesus responds by giving Pilate a proper understanding of what his kingdom is all about. Jesus literally says, "My kingdom is not from here. My kingdom is not from here. My kingdom is very different than the kingdoms of the world because my kingdom does not conquer through violence. My people would be fighting for me." Pilate, if you thought that Rome had anything to fear by what I'm doing, it ought to be obvious by now that that's not the case. Because my people are not fighting to set me free. He says, "My kingdom is a kingdom of truth." His purpose for becoming king is to testify to the truth. And everyone who is on the side of truth listens to him. What is the truth that Jesus came to witness to? Jesus said he came to witness to the truth. What truth? I would say it's the truth of the gospel. Because the gospel summarizes all of what truth is. What God has done, what God is doing, and what God will do through Jesus. Jesus came to witness, to testify to that truth. And Pilate very cynically says, "What is truth?" He's probably of the belief that who can know such a thing? Is there even an answer to such a question? What is truth? All the while, he's in the room with the very embodiment of truth. Either way, he doesn't see Jesus as a threat, and so he goes out and he tells the accusers, these Jewish leaders, that Jesus is innocent. I don't find anything wrong with him. He's not guilty of any capital crime. That leads us up to Luke 23, verse 5. But they kept on insisting, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place." When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion, and behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. So the Jewish people, they are insistent. Pilate says, I don't see anything wrong with the guy. But they are insistent that they have to have something done to this disturber of the peace. This man who is just messing everything up, he needs to be dealt with. And so they let slip that Jesus is from Galilee. He's from up north. And so Pilate, probably happily, sends him over to Herod. This is a problem. This is an inconvenience for him. And I don't like Herod anyway. I'll send Jesus over there. Have Herod take care of it. Herod was very happy. Herod was the one who had Jesus' cousin John the Baptizer put to death. He was a wicked man, very terrible, terrible person. But he had heard a lot about Jesus, and he wanted to see some miracles. He wanted Jesus to play the part of the circus monkey. Do some tricks for me. Show me some really neat stuff. And Jesus wouldn't even say a word to him. And so Herod decided to make his own fun out of the situation, and he decides to have Jesus dressed up and mocks him a little bit. But overall, Herod also says, yeah, the guy's innocent. Not guilty of anything. So both Pilate and Herod believe Jesus is innocent of all charges. So in hopes of gratifying the angry Jewish leaders, Pilate decides to punish Jesus and then release him. That's his plan. Jesus is not dying today. I'm going to punish him because of all this trouble he's brought about. He's obviously done something to upset you. I'll punish him, give him a strong warning, and send him home. That's the plan. Go to John chapter 19. This is where John picks up after Luke. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews! And to give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus then came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. So the chief priests and the officers saw him, and they cried out, saying, Crucify, crucify! Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. See, Matthew's account tells us that Pilate's wife, she'd been having some really bad dreams. And she sent a message to Pilate saying, Don't have any dealings with this Jesus. He's a righteous, he's an innocent man. Leave him alone. It's pretty odd, right? We think things about our dreams sometimes. Well, the ancient people, they thought a lot about their dreams. Their dreams meant something. My wife is having dreams saying this man is innocent. The gods or someone is sending her dreams telling us to leave Jesus alone. And now the people are telling me some new information they didn't tell me before. This man isn't just saying that he's the king. They say he says he's God's son. And this gets him a little bit shaken up. And so he goes back inside, and I love the question he asked Jesus. Where are you from? What's funny about that is Pilate's not saying, where on earth are you from? Because he already knows he's from Galilee. We've already been through that. Pilate wants to know where Jesus is from. And Jesus just looked at him. Wouldn't say a word. Keep on reading. Verse 10. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." So they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he then handed him over to them to be crucified. Luke told us that Pilate had decided to punish and release Jesus. And then we see Pilate have Jesus scourged. That was the punishment. Now, the Romans had 3 types of scourging. There was one that was less severe. It was for very minor things, light offenses. And it was often followed by a very severe warning, "Don't you ever do this again." And then you send them home. This might have been the punishment that Jesus received before he would be released. Then there's the second type of scourging, which is a pretty brutal. It's a much more brutal scourging that was always for major serious offenses. This could have been what Jesus received as punishment before he would be released. But then there's the third type of scourging. And it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And it was always followed by other punishments like crucifixion. The criminal would be stripped down of all of their clothing. They would be tied to a post. And then they would be whipped by several different torturers until the torturers were either exhausted or their commanding officer told them to stop. Non-Roman citizens were often scourged with a whip, with leather thongs, and it would have at the end of these little strips either bone or lead or some other kind of metal. And these scourgings were so severe that many times the victim would die. Not all the time, maybe not even most of the time, but many times. There'd be death from this. Eyewitness records report that sometimes the victims would have parts of their body that are underneath your skin that are not supposed to be exposed. I'll just put it that way. This probably isn't what Jesus received as punishment before his release. And the reason I say that is Pilate still planned on releasing Jesus. He had every intention of doing that. Pilate just wanted to beat and humiliate Jesus enough to where the bloodthirsty Jewish leaders would be pacified and he could send him home. And so Pilate had Jesus punished, and then when he was just about to release him, the Jewish leaders, they pull out their trump card. They pull out the one they had to have been saving for the very end. If all else fails, we'll do this. If you release Jesus, you are not a friend of Caesar. Now right there, that's all it took. That's all it took for Pilate to sentence Jesus to death. Matthew's account tells us that he washes his hands and he pronounces himself innocent of Jesus' blood, and he hands him over to be crucified. At the same time, he releases an actual insurrectionist and murderer, Barabbas. It's hard to know for sure all of the details. None of the accounts give us all the details. But it's likely that Jesus was then handed over to the torturers, who then scourged Jesus with that most severe type of scourging. Because that was normally reserved for those who would be crucified. When Jesus was being punished before and he received a scourging, he was not at that point to be crucified. It was just a punishment. This, now that he's being delivered over to be crucified, we can't know for sure, but I think it's very likely. Jesus was then scourged in the most horrific and torturous type of way. Either way, Jesus experienced very real torture from people who were simply envious of him, and from a man who believed with all his heart that this man was innocent. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the crucifixion of Jesus. We'll see him be exalted and lifted high. This morning we saw the coronation of King Jesus. If you didn't quite catch it, let's look at Matthew's more detailed account, and then we'll end the lesson. Matthew 27, verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." The anointed king, he is surrounded by soldiers who have sworn to protect the crown. I want you to picture the scene. They placed a royal robe on him. They placed a royal crown on his head. They placed a royal scepter in his hand. They pay homage to him by kneeling before him. They salute him by saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." This is a coronation. This is a crowning of the king, but in the most humiliating and painful way. They meant it for evil, right? But God meant it for good. He did this. He went through this horrible coronation ceremony to rescue us from sin and death, to reconcile us to our Heavenly Father, to restore all things to the pre-fall perfection. He did this for us. And as we think about Jesus mockingly dressed as a king, with blood and bruises and lacerations covering his body, the only proper response is to kneel. To kneel, pay homage, pledge our total and lifelong allegiance to King Jesus. I've been thinking about this text for several weeks now. A lot of times, I don't know how many of you are familiar with putting together lessons and teaching or whatever, but a lot of times you try to think, okay, what's a good application? What's a good practical lesson to take from this text? And I've been thinking about this for a while. And I've struggled with this text because every single thing I think of, every time I think of a way to explain this or go into detail on this or talk about this text, this coronation of Jesus in any way, I always come back to, that's woefully inadequate. It's not good enough. And so that's why I decided, you know what? Most of my talking this morning is going to be me reading. I'm just going to read. I'm going to read a lot of stuff. read from Luke and John and get all the details. Because when it comes down to it, there's nothing I could say to you right now to encourage you or edify you or try to get you to live for Jesus. There's nothing I could say that would be adequate for what we just read. You just have to listen. Think about what Jesus went through. Think about what he did and why he did it. And then make your decision. Who do you live for? Do you live for yourself? Or do you live for Jesus? Is your loyalty to yourself or is your loyalty to Jesus? Have you given your allegiance to yourself or your allegiance to Jesus? This is when Jesus became king. When the crown was placed upon his head, it doesn't look like other coronation ceremonies because it wasn't like other coronation ceremonies. This wasn't any king who's going to be lavished with gold and silver and be presented as the greatest thing that's ever walked the earth. This was humiliating. This was painful. This was terrible. And yet, it was done for the King of all the universe. And he did it willingly. For you and for me. And so I'm going to leave it at that. You make your decision as to how you're living your life. As to who you're living your life for. Are you living it for Jesus? Are we living for Jesus? He is our King. Do we act like it? If you have any needs at all this morning, we would like to help you with those. If you're not a believer, you've not given your allegiance over to King Jesus, be immersed in him. Be baptized into Christ this morning. Christians, are you living faithfully? Are you living as if you truly have given your allegiance to the King? If you need prayers, encouragement, whatever it may be, our elders are going to be in the back of the room. You can go and you can speak to them. They'll pray with you. They'll talk with you. If you need anything else, need prayers, need encouragement, you'd like to do it publicly, you can come forward as we stand and sing.